The day Ralph Ford saved Annie Redmond's wagon from rolling into the gulch off Miller's Pass. He did not do it because he was brave or because he was looking for a reason to speak to someone. He did it because the wheel had caught a loose stone, and the whole rig was tilting at an angle that made his stomach drop, and his hands moved before his mind had time to form a single thought. That was the autumn of 1874, in the dry red dust of Caro County, Texas, where the wind came in off the plains like something with a grudge, and the mesquite trees leaned permanently to the east, as if they had long since given up arguing with it. The town at the base of the pass was called Harlan's Creek, named after a man who had died of fever before the town had a church or a jail or anything worth naming a place after. But the name stuck the way names do in the West, with no logic and no ceremony. Ralph was 31 years old. He had come to Harlan's Creek the previous spring with a bedroll, a brown horse named Colt who was not particularly fast, and $37 in his coat pocket. He had spent 11 of those dollars on a room above the grain store that smelled of old sorghum and mouse droppings. He had spent 6 more on food and 2 on a new cinch strap, because the old one had rotted through somewhere between San Antonio and the Pecos River. He had $18 left and a slow accumulation of work, mending fences for Caldwell's cattle operation east of town, hauling timber for the new telegraph office, and occasionally helping the farrier when his hands swelled up with the joint sickness that had been eating at him since the war. Nobody in Harlan's Creek had chosen Ralph for anything. He had not been elected to a committee, or asked to lead a cattle drive, or appointed to serve in any capacity that required someone to look at him and decide he was the one. He had not been picked first in any contest of strength or skill. He had not been the man that women's eyes settled on when they walked into a room. He was not ugly, but he was plain in the way that certain honest things are plain, like a well-made wooden chair or a clear sky. He had brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that were calm to the point of seeming distant, and his hands were large and rough, and the left one had a long scar running from the base of his thumb to his wrist from a barbed wire incident 3 years prior. He did not think much about being unchosen. It had been the condition of his life for so long that it felt less like a wound and more like the weather. His mother had died when he was 7. His father had been a decent man but a distracted one, the kind of man who looked at his son and saw something he did not quite know what to do with, so he sent him to work on neighboring farms by age 10 and never quite managed to bring him back. Ralph had worked his way across the southern states by the time he was 18, never in one place long enough to put down the kind of roots that let you belong to somewhere or to someone. He had been in the Confederate Army for a year and a half during the war, not because he believed in the cause with any particular fire, but because young men with no land and no family and no real stake in anything often end up in the current of history without choosing it, swept along by what the men around them are doing. He had fired a rifle, marched in the heat, seen things he had folded away into the back of his mind like old letters he did not intend to read again, and then walked home when it was over. Home, at that point, being a concept more than a place. By the time he landed in Harlan's Creek, he had lived in 12 different towns across 3 states. He had been a ranch hand, a mule driver, a timber cutter, a fence mender, a part-time cook at a logging camp, and one memorable winter, a piano mover in Abilene, which was not a skill anyone had particularly sought him out for but which had paid decently. He had never been anyone's first choice for anything important. The wagon on Miller's Pass changed nothing and everything. Annie Redmond had been driving the wagon herself because her hired hand, a 16-year-old boy named Pete Garvey, had come down with a chest sickness and was back at the boarding house coughing into a handkerchief while Annie made the supply run to Roper's Crossing that she had promised the Harlan's Creek General Store she would complete by Thursday. She was 26 years old, and she did not believe in sitting still while things needed doing. She had been driving wagons since she was 12. She knew how to handle a team. but the stone that caught the rear wheel was wedged at exactly the wrong angle, and for a moment the whole world tilted, and then two large hands appeared at the side of the wagon, and a broad shoulder hit the rear panel, and the wheel came free with a sound like a gunshot, and the rig rolled back onto solid ground. Annie had pulled the team to a halt and sat there for a full 4 seconds before she climbed down. Ralph was already walking away. "Wait," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned to carry across open ground. He stopped. He turned around. He looked at her the way he looked at most things, steadily and without excessive expression. "I would like to thank you," she said. "It's all right," he said. He meant that no thanks were necessary, but it came out sounding like something else. She studied him for a moment. She was a woman of medium height with dark reddish-brown hair that she kept pinned up but which came loose in strands around her face in the wind. She had brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive, and she had a dusting of freckles across her nose and the upper part of her cheeks that she had never thought much about one way or another. She was wearing a sensible brown dress and work gloves and boots that had been resoled at least once. "You work in town?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "I do what's needed. Who do you work for right now?" "Nobody in particular." She looked at the wagon, she looked at the road ahead, she looked at the sky with the practiced eye of someone who understood weather, then she looked back at him. "My name is Annie Redmond," she said. "I have a dry goods operation, small one. I could use someone to help with hauling and deliveries for the next few weeks while my regular hand is sick. Would that interest you?" Ralph looked at her for a moment. He was trying to determine if she was the kind of woman who said things she did not mean, and he decided within about 10 seconds that she was not. "Yes," he said. "It would." "Good," she said. "I'll pay you $1 a day and meals when you're working on the premises. Come to the store on Elm Street tomorrow morning at 7. She climbed back up onto the wagon with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, clicked to the team, and rolled on down the pass. Ralph stood in the red dust of the road and watched the wagon go and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the quiet hum of being somewhere that might matter. He showed up the next morning at 6:45. He was not a man who was late. Annie's store was modest but well organized. It occupied the ground floor of a building she rented from old Walt Harmon, who owned half the structures on Elm Street, and lived above the saddle shop in studied indifference to the activity below him. The store had 4 long shelves of dry goods, a counter with a scale and a cash box, a back room full of crates and barrels, and a window that looked out onto the street where the morning light came in at an angle and lit the dust motes like gold. She lived in a 2-room apartment behind the back room, which was a practical arrangement that she had negotiated herself when she set up the business 18 months prior. Annie had come to Harlan's Creek on her own terms. She was the daughter of a dry goods merchant in San Marcos, and she had grown up knowing how to inventory stock and balance accounts and talk to suppliers without getting cheated. When her father died of a heart complaint in the spring of 1872, she had taken her portion of the inheritance, said goodbye to her 2 older brothers who were not particularly interested in her opinions, and come west to build something of her own. Her mother had died years before, and Annie had always felt more at home behind a counter than behind a man, which was not a sentiment that earned her many friends among the women of San Marcos who thought a young woman's first task was to find a husband, and her second task was to stop doing anything that made her too visible. Harlan's Creek had been more indifferent to her ambitions than hostile to them, which she found refreshing. People in small frontier towns tended to respect competence because competence was scarce, and survival was not a matter of sentiment. She had built a steady business in 18 months and earned a reputation for being fair and for not giving credit to men who would not pay it back, which was a policy that had cost her some customers initially, and then slowly, as those same men defaulted on credit at the other establishments in town, had made her the preferred option for the ones who actually had money. She had also earned a reputation for being someone who could not be pressured, which had come mostly from a single incident with a cattle broker named Denton Hale, who had tried to convince her to lower her prices by standing too close and speaking too quietly and implying things that were not quite said aloud. Annie had looked at him for a long moment and then told him, in a voice loud enough for the two other customers in the store to hear clearly, that she would be happy to continue doing business with him on her stated terms, and that if he could not accept those terms, she wished him good morning. Hale had turned the color of a boiled beet and left. He had come back 3 weeks later and bought flour and salt at her stated prices without a word about it. Ralph learned all of this gradually, not because Annie told him directly, but because in a small town, the shape of a person becomes visible through many small observations over time. He heard things in the grain store and at the feed post. He watched her with customers. He carried things and loaded things and drove the wagon on 2 supply runs and fixed a broken shelf bracket and rehung a door that had been sticking since last summer. He was careful. He was quiet. He did not presume. He showed up on time and he did what was asked, and when she said he could go for the day, he went. He did not linger on her doorstep or find excuses to stay. He had learned early in life that the space between being useful and being unwelcome was narrow, and he was practiced at reading where it fell. What he did not know, and would not have believed if someone had told him, was that Annie Redmond had begun paying attention to him in a way that had nothing to do with barrel counts and delivery schedules. It started with small things. The way he fixed the shelf bracket without being asked twice, without making a show of it, and without expecting particular praise when it was done. The way he talked to old Hattie Greer, who bought her cornmeal every Wednesday and who talked at considerable length about her grandchildren while she did it, and Ralph would stand with the cornmeal bag ready and listen with the same patient attention he gave to everything. The way he handled Colt, his horse, with a kind of quiet affection that was not sentimental but was genuine. A man's relationship with his horse told you things about him that could take years to learn otherwise. She noticed his hands. She noticed the scar on the left one and did not ask about it because she understood that some things a person carries without wanting to explain them. She noticed that when he ate the noon meal she left out on the work table in the back room, he ate without rushing and without waste and without complaining. And when she made something that came out less well than she intended, he said nothing negative about it. He was not fulsome with compliments either. He simply ate and said thank you. She noticed that he laughed at the right things and not at the wrong ones. It was a Wednesday in the second week of November when she chose him. She would remember it as a Wednesday later when she thought back on the sequence of things. The morning had been ordinary. Ralph had come at 7, had moved 3 crates of tinned goods from the back room to the shelves, had resorted the sugar bags because a mouse had found its way into one and the rest needed to be checked, and had eaten the noon meal, which was biscuits, and the previous night's bean stew warmed on the small iron stove. Annie was at the counter going over her accounts ledger. The light was coming in through the window at that particular afternoon angle. The store was quiet. The town outside was going through its midday slow period when even the horses at the hitching posts looked as if they were taking a moment to rest. She looked up from the ledger and Ralph was stacking the checked sugar bags in order of size against the back wall, his back to her, working with his careful, unhurried competence. And something happened in her chest that she recognized immediately and without drama, the way you recognize a road you have not traveled in a long time but that your body remembers. She chose him, right then. In the quiet of the Wednesday afternoon, with the smell of beans and dust and dry goods all around her, and the sound of one horse clomping past outside, she made a decision about Ralph Ford that was so clear and so settled that it did not frighten her at all. The difficulty was in the execution. She was not a timid woman, but she was a careful one. She understood that there was a difference between knowing what you wanted and knowing how to move toward it without frightening it away. Ralph was, she had observed, a man who was not accustomed to being wanted. There was something about the way he held himself, not cold but careful, as if he had learned to take up no more space than was given to him, and to expect that what was given might at any moment be taken back. A woman who moved too fast or too loudly toward such a man might cause him to believe he had misunderstood something and retreat into the familiar safety of being unremarkable. So she moved slowly. She started leaving out 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1, without comment, as if it had always been done. Ralph noticed and said nothing and drank the coffee with both hands around the mug the way people do when they are cold, and the warmth is welcome. The November mornings in Harlan's Creek had started turning sharp, and the stove in the back room took time to drive the chill out of the air. She started talking to him more during the day, not about business or not only about business. She asked him once where he had come from originally. He said Central Tennessee, a small farm operation south of Nashville. She asked if he had family there still. He said no family. She did not push further. She told him that she had grown up in San Marcos and that she had 2 brothers who were useful enough men, but who had never quite managed to believe that a woman's opinion on a commercial matter was worth the same as a man's, and that this had been the primary reason she had moved west. He looked at her when she said this with an expression that she could not entirely read, but that seemed, she thought, to be something like recognition. The second week of November gave way to the third, and Pete Garvey recovered from his chest sickness and came back to work, which was a complication Annie had not anticipated with particular enthusiasm. She found that she needed to redistribute the work carefully to justify keeping both Ralph and Pete on, and she did this with creative accounting that she did not feel entirely honest about, but justified to herself on the grounds that Pete was a boy who needed the income and Ralph was a man who was good at the work and whose presence had become, she admitted in the quieter parts of her own thinking, something that organized her days in a way she valued. She told Ralph that Pete would be doing the lighter work and the counter shifts, and that she had regular supply runs and heavier hauling that needed someone with experience, and she would like him to stay on indefinitely if he was willing. She said this at the end of the third week, standing in the back room with the afternoon light low and the stove burning steadily, and she said it in a tone that was businesslike and practical and gave away nothing of the November Wednesday decision she had made. Ralph looked at her steadily. He said, "I would like that." She said, "Good. Same terms." He nodded and put on his coat and went out to see to Colt, who was in the small lean-to stable she rented from Walt Harmon alongside the building. Annie stood in the back room for a moment after he was gone and breathed carefully. It was the 4th week of November when the situation with Denton Hale became, for the first time, a real problem rather than a managed irritation. Hale had been buying from Annie's store without incident for the better part of 2 months, but he had in that time also been developing a dispute with her over a land parcel that she had nothing to do with, and that had, as far as anyone could tell, originated in some confusion over a survey map and a property boundary that had been imprecisely drawn when Harlan's Creek was first platted. The confusion was being sorted out slowly by the county clerk in the absence of anyone with the authority to do it faster, and in the meantime Hale had taken the position that Annie's building sat 4 feet into a strip of land that he believed was his, and he had begun making occasional remarks about it in public that were designed to create the impression that Annie Redmond was running a business on disputed property, and that her operations were therefore somehow irregular. It was a thin strategy, but it had some effect, not because anyone who knew Annie believed it, but because Harlan's Creek had a significant transient population of cattlemen and traders who did not know her and who heard Hale's remarks and took them at face value. 2 of her regular wholesale accounts had quietly reduced their orders, and she suspected Hale was behind it. Ralph heard about the land dispute from the farrier, whose shop was directly across the street and who had an opinion on everything that happened within 200 yards of his forge. He said nothing to Annie about it directly. But the next morning he came in earlier than usual at 6:30 and asked if she had the survey map for the building. She looked at him with some surprise. "I have Walt Harmon's lease documents," she said, "and Walt has the original land grant, and Hale's claim, based on a different map that the county drew in 1869, she said. "Walt says it was wrong then and it's wrong now." "Has anyone measured?" She paused. "Not officially." Ralph said, "I know how to take a survey measurement. Not professionally, but I worked with a land company in Oklahoma for a season, and I know how it's done. If you want, I can take the measurements and we can see what they show." She looked at him again with that direct brown gaze that he had come to find was one of the most arresting things he had ever experienced, because it was never unkind and never false and never calculating. It was simply attentive. She looked at people the way someone who respected them looked at them. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you." He took the measurements over 2 mornings using a surveying chain that he borrowed from the county clerk's office, where a board deputy named Elias let him take it in exchange for $50. He was methodical and careful. He started from the corner post that all 3 adjacent property owners agreed on and worked from there with the chain and a set of stakes and a piece of paper on which he made careful notations. When he was done, he brought his measurements to Annie and they sat at the back room table together and compared them against the 2 maps. The 1869 county map was wrong, not by a lot, but by enough. The boundary line had been drawn a full 6 feet east of where the actual corner post stood, and if you followed the original land grant survey, Annie's building was not on Hale's land at all. It was comfortably within the property that Walt Harmon held and rented. They were sitting at the table with the papers spread between them and Ralph's careful notations laid alongside. The stove was going. The afternoon had gone gray outside. Ralph pointed to the relevant figures and explained how he had arrived at them, and Annie followed along with her finger on the map, and her hair coming loose at the sides of her face and her brow slightly contracted in concentration. And she was so close that he could smell the faint rose water that she used in her hair and the clean dry goods smell of the store that had become part of her. And he became so completely aware of every inch of proximity between them that he had to concentrate with some force on the surveying figures in order to continue speaking. "So Hale's claim is based on the wrong map," she said. "Yes." "And this," she touched his notations, "would hold up if the county clerk reviewed it." "I believe so. You might want to have it confirmed by someone with official credentials, but the measurements would point the same direction." She sat back and looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. She said, "Ralph, you did not have to do this." He said, "I know." There was a pause that was not exactly comfortable but was not uncomfortable either. It was the kind of pause that happens between 2 people when something is present in the room that neither of them has yet put words to. She said, "You are very capable. I don't think you know that about yourself." He looked at the papers. He said, "I'm useful." "That's not the same thing," she said quietly. He did not answer. He did not know how she let it rest. She gathered the papers into a neat stack and said she would bring them to Walt Harmon in the morning and that Walt could take the matter to the county clerk himself, which was a more official approach than her doing it directly. Ralph nodded and put on his coat. At the door he stopped. He turned around. He said, "For what it's worth, whatever Hale has been saying around town, anyone who has done business with you would know it for what it is." She looked at him. She said, "Thank you." He went out into the November evening. The sky was the color of gunmetal, and the first stars were coming out over the mesa to the west. He walked to the boarding house where he kept his room, which was still the room above the grain store, though he had long since grown accustomed to the smell of sorghum, and he sat on the edge of the iron bed and looked at the floor for a while. He was not a man who was given to elaborate interior analysis. He had learned that thinking too much about things you could not have was a way of making yourself unhappy without the benefit of anything to show for it. But the thing he had been carefully not thinking about was becoming harder to not think about. Annie Redmond had looked at him in that back room and said that being useful was not the same as being capable, and the words had gone into him somewhere that was not ready for them. He thought about what it would mean to want something that particular. He was not practiced at it. December arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature across the county and brought thin clouds and the smell of distant rain that never quite arrived. The store grew busier as people laid in supplies before the worst of winter. Ralph worked long days. He and Pete Garvey had developed a workable division of labor, with Pete handling the counter and the lighter work and Ralph doing the hauling and heavy lifting, and the outside work. Pete was a cheerful boy who talked a great deal about very little, and Ralph was patient with him in the same way he was patient with everything, which Pete interpreted as agreement, and which Annie interpreted as kindness. On a Friday evening in the second week of December, Annie asked Ralph to stay after closing to help her move a set of heavy shelving units from the back room to a new position along the south wall, which she had decided would improve the flow of customer traffic through the store. It was the kind of task that required two people and some coordination, and they spent an hour shifting the units and adjusting them, and then standing back to look at the effect, and then shifting them slightly again. When it was done, Annie made coffee on the small stove and they stood in the back room with their cups. The store was dark and closed around them, and the street outside was quiet. A coyote called somewhere distant, and the sound came in under the closed door thin and clear. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Have you ever thought about staying somewhere permanently? I mean in one place for a long time." He considered the question as he considered all questions with some care. He said, "I've thought about it. I haven't found a place that made it seem possible." "What would make it possible?" Another pause. He said, "Something worth staying for." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. She said, "Do you think about Harlan's Creek that way, as somewhere worth staying?" He looked up then, and she held his gaze with her honest, direct attention, and he felt the thing that had been gathering in him for weeks press against the edges of what he was willing to admit. He said, "I think about it more than I've thought about any other place." She nodded slowly. She said, "Good," and then she said good night and went through to her rooms behind the back wall. He stood for a moment and then let himself out through the store and walked home through the cold December dark with the coyote still calling somewhere out on the plain. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the iron bed above the grain store and looked at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to him. He had learned over 31 years to want very little and to hold lightly what he had, because wanting things led to expecting them, and expecting them led to being hurt when they were taken away, and things were always taken away. That was the logic he had lived by, and it had served him, not well but reliably. Annie Redmond was doing something to that logic that he did not have a name for. He showed up the next morning at 7, and she was behind the counter going through invoices, and she looked up and said good morning in the same tone she always used, and he said good morning and went to work, and everything was ordinary. And the ordinariness of it was, he realized, one of the things that made it matter. The land dispute with Denton Hale was resolved in the third week of December, faster than anyone had expected. Walt Harmon brought Ralph's survey measurements to the county clerk along with the original land grant documents, and the county clerk, a methodical man named Poole who had been made tired by Hale's complaints over several months, had compared the measurements himself and confirmed the error in the 1869 map, and issued a written finding that Annie's building was on Harmon's correctly titled land and that Hale's claim was without foundation. Hale received a formal notice that his dispute was closed and was advised not to raise it again. Annie heard about the finding on a Thursday morning when Walt Harmon came into the store himself, which he almost never did, and told her over the counter with a satisfaction that his usual indifference could not entirely conceal. She thanked him and he said it was nothing, the measurements had done the work, and he left. She told Ralph when he came in that the dispute was resolved. He said he was glad to hear it. She said she wanted to take him to dinner at the hotel dining room that evening as a way of saying thank you, not as an employer to a worker, but as one person to another. She said this with a directness that did not leave much room for misinterpretation, and she watched his face while she said it. Something moved behind his gray eyes. He said, "You do not need to do that," she said. "I know I do not need to. I want to." He stood very still for a moment. He said, "All right." The hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in Harlan's Creek by a considerable margin. It had actual tablecloths and a menu written on a chalkboard, and a cook who had come west from St. Louis and who produced, on his best nights, food that made people feel briefly civilized. Annie wore a blue dress that she kept for occasions and her hair down with only a few pins to keep it from her face. Ralph wore the cleanest of his shirts and had taken some care with his hair and his hands, and he had the look of a man who was uncertain and working very hard not to show it. They sat across from each other at a table near the window. Outside, the December night was deeply cold, and a few thin snowflakes were falling without commitment. The dining room was warm and smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke and candle wax. They talked easily at first, about the land dispute and the county clerk and old Walt Harmon's rare moment of active interest. Then the conversation moved to other things. She told him more about her father and his store in San Marcos, about the way she had grown up among bolts of fabric and barrel taps, and the quiet arithmetic of commerce that she had always found more honest than most other human activities, because the numbers either added up or they did not. He told her about Tennessee, more than he usually told people. About the farm and the way the mornings had smelled in summer, and about a neighbor's dog he had been fond of as a boy. He did not tell her about the war in any detail, but he told her that it had taken 2 years of his life, and that he had been glad to walk away from it. She asked him once carefully whether he had anyone, in the sense of family or people who were his. He said no. She said neither did she, really, except for the 2 brothers who were good men in their limited way. He said that must be lonely sometimes. She said that it was sometimes, yes. He said that he had been lonely for so long that it had become his version of normal, and that he was not sure now what the alternative would feel like. She looked at him across the table with the candle between them and said very quietly that perhaps that was something that could change. He looked at her. She held the look. The snowflakes fell against the window glass. He said, "Annie." He said her name as if testing the sound of it in this context, as if he had not quite dared to use it this directly before. "I want to be honest with you. I'm not a man who has been given much. I do not have money or land or any kind of prospects that would look impressive to anyone. I have my horse and my skills, and I am reliable, but I am not much else." She said, "Who told you that being reliable is not much?" He said, "No one told me. It's just true." She said, "Ralph, I have lived among unreliable men my entire life. My brothers were unreliable. Denton Hale was unreliable. Most of the men who come into my store and negotiate prices are unreliable. Reliable is not a small thing. Reliable is one of the most valuable things in the world." He looked at her. He did not speak. She said, "I am also a woman running a small business in a frontier town who does not have a lot of pretensions about what she needs. I need someone honest. I need someone steady. I need someone who does not think I am too much simply because I know what I want." He said, "I do not think you are too much." She said, "I know. That is part of why I am saying this." The snow was coming down more seriously now, small soft flakes catching the light from the window. The dining room had grown quieter as the evening moved on. 2 other couples remained at distant tables, paying them no attention. Ralph looked at his hands on the table. He said, "I have never been chosen for anything in my whole life." He said it without self-pity. He said it the way someone states a plain fact. "I have always been the one who shows up and does the work, and then the thing ends and I move on. I don't know what it looks like when something doesn't end." She reached across the table and put her hand on top of his. His hand was large and rough and scarred, and her hand was smaller and also roughened by work, but she laid it across his with no hesitation. She said, "It looks like this, like someone putting her hand over yours and meaning to leave it there." He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. Something in him was very still and very loud at the same time, two contradictory states occupying the same space, and he thought that this was what it felt like when something that had been shut for a long time began slowly to open. He turned his hand over so that her hand was in his, and he held it carefully, as if it were something he did not want to mishandle. He said, "I do not know what to do with this." She said, "You do not have to know right now. You can learn." He said, "I would like to try." She smiled at him. It was not a triumphant smile. It was warm and steady and real, the kind of smile that came from somewhere honest. He had seen her smile at customers and at Pete and at old Hattie Greer with her cornmeal, but this was different. This was a smile that was for him specifically, that had his name on it. He was 31 years old, and he felt, sitting in that hotel dining room in the December snow of Harlins Creek, Texas, in the year 1874, like something was beginning that he had no map for and no prior experience with. And the terrifying part was that it did not frighten him the way the things that could be taken away had always frightened him. It felt, instead, like ground under his feet. They walked back through the light snow after dinner, the main street of Harlins Creek quiet and white-hedged and still. The cold was clean and sharp. Their breath made small clouds. He walked her to the store, and she stood on the step, and they looked at each other, and she said good night, and he said good night. And then she went inside, and he stood on the step for a moment before he turned and walked back to his room above the grain store. He sat on the edge of the bed, and he did not think about all the ways it could go wrong. He thought instead about her hand in his. He thought about the word she had used, steadiness. He had always thought of his steadiness as something unremarkable, the minimum requirement for basic decency. She had named it as if it were a thing worth having. He had not been chosen for anything in his whole life. She had chosen him. He did not entirely know what to do with it, but for the first time in 31 years, not knowing what to do did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of learning something. Christmas came to Harlins Creek with a modest kind of celebration. A decorated tree in the town square that was a scraggly cedar someone had hauled in from the ridge. A church service that most of the town attended for reasons that ranged from genuine faith to simple loneliness. And a general easing of commerce as people settled in around fires and ate more than they usually allowed themselves. Annie kept the store open until midday on Christmas Eve, and then closed it for 2 days, which was the longest she had closed it in 18 months. She invited Ralph to Christmas dinner. She cooked it herself in the small kitchen attached to her rooms behind the store. He brought a bottle of wine that he had spent more than he should have on at the general store across town, and she laughed when she saw it and said he absolutely did not need to do that, and he said he wanted to. She made a roast chicken and sweet potatoes and biscuits and a dried apple cake that was better than it had any right to be given the limited resources of a frontier kitchen. They sat at her small table in the rooms behind the store and ate and talked, and outside the December afternoon was gray and still. She had hung a few paper decorations on the wall, small stars cut out with scissors, and there was a candle on the table, and the room was warm from the cook stove. She had known him for almost 3 months. She knew how he held his coffee cup. She knew the way he went quiet when he was thinking, and that the quiet was not absence but presence, that he was paying close attention. She knew that he was not comfortable with compliments, but that he held them when she gave them to him with a kind of careful reverence, as if he were not sure what to do with them but did not want to drop them. He knew her too, in the ways that accumulate through work and proximity and small daily exchanges. He knew that she made decisions quickly but not rashly. He knew that she was harder on herself than on anyone else, and that when she made an error in her accounts she would sit at the ledger until she found it, even if it took 2 hours. not because she was a perfectionist, but because accuracy was something she considered a form of honesty. He knew that she sang very quietly when she thought she was alone in the back room, not real songs, just small melodic phrases that rose and fell like thought. After dinner, they sat with their wine and talked about next year, what she hoped the store might do, what he might learn that would be useful. He had begun to think about acquiring a skill that would be worth more than daily labor. He had been reading about blacksmithing in a manual that the farrier had lent him, and he was considering whether it was something he might pursue formally, an apprenticeship of some kind, though he was 31 and apprenticeships were more naturally the province of younger men. She told him that 31 was not old, and that a man who knew how to measure land and fix things and pay attention could learn anything he put his mind to. He said, "You have a high opinion of me." She said, "I have an accurate opinion of you. Those happen to be the same thing in this case." He looked at her across the small table with the candle between them, and he felt the warmth in his chest that he had been feeling more and more consistently in her company. The warmth that he was slowly learning was not an anomaly but something that belonged to him, that had been extended to him, and could, if he was careful and brave and willing to believe it, be kept. He reached across the table and took her hand the way she had taken his at the hotel dining room, reversing it, his hand covering hers. He said, "Annie, I want you to know that I am not going anywhere." She looked at him. She said, "I know." He said, "I mean it as a statement, not a question. I wanted to say it plainly." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his and said, "Then I will say plainly back, I am glad." In January, Ralph moved out of the room above the grain store and into the small room above the stable behind the store, which was better ventilated and smelled considerably better than sorghum, and which was also, though neither of them made a point of acknowledging this directly, considerably closer. He paid Walt Harmon a modest weekly sum for it, and continued on the same working terms with Annie, though by this point everyone in Harlan's Creek who paid attention to anything had drawn their own conclusions about the nature of the arrangement. Old Hattie Greer told Annie one Wednesday while buying her cornmeal that Ralph Ford was a good steady man, and that a woman could do considerably worse, and in Harlan's Creek frequently had. Annie thanked her and kept her expression neutral, which was a significant exercise of self-control. The farrier told Ralph one morning in the middle of January, with the bluntness of a man who had spent 30 years working with hot metal and had no patience for indirection, that Annie Redmond was the best person in this town, and that if he was not a fool he would make his intentions clear and formal. Ralph said he appreciated the advice. The farrier said advice was not what it was a statement of fact, and then hammered something very hard for emphasis. Ralph was not unaware that intentions needed to become clearer. He thought about it constantly and without much resolution, held in the particular paralysis of a man who wanted something very much and was afraid that wanting it too directly might somehow break it. He was aware of this as a weakness. He was working on it. The thing that moved him past the paralysis was, in the end, not any particular dramatic moment but a small and ordinary one. It was a Tuesday in late January. He was in the stable seeing to Colt after a supply run, brushing him down in the late afternoon light. The stable smelled of hay and horse and cold air. He could hear Annie in the store, which shared a wall with the stable, talking to a customer in that clear, unhurried voice. He was brushing Colt's flank and listening to her voice through the wall, and he thought, "This is what I want, every day. This sound through a wall, this ordinary nearness, this person on the other side of a small distance." He finished with Colt and washed his hands at the pump and walked into the back room of the store and waited until the customer had gone, and Pete had gone to close up the front. She came into the back room and found him standing there, and she said, "Everything all right?" He said, "Yes." He said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. He said, "I want to ask if you would be willing to consider marrying me. I know I do not have much to offer in the material sense, but I am going to learn a trade, and I am going to work harder than I already do, and I will not leave. I will not ever leave. That is something I can say with certainty." She was very still. Then she said, "Ralph," he said, "I know it is not a grand proposal. I do not have a ring or anything that would look right in a story." She said, "Come here." He took 2 steps toward her, and she put both her hands on either side of his face and looked at him with those brown eyes that were so honest they could make a man feel transparent. And she said, "Yes, that is my answer, and you have more to offer than you have ever allowed yourself to believe." He put his hands over hers, at the sides of his own face, and stood like that for a moment. He was not a man who cried, and he did not cry, but something in him that had been held in a posture of bracing for a very long time slowly lowered, the way a man who has been carrying something heavy sets it down when he finally reaches where he was going. He kissed her then, for the first time, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, without hesitation and without pretense, and the back room of the dry goods store smelled of beans and coffee and the last of the day's fire in the stove, and outside the January night was settling in over Harlan's Creek with its cold blue silence. They were married on a Saturday in early March of 1875, when the weather had softened enough for people to stand outside in their good clothes without misery. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, a traveling Methodist minister named Abernathy who came through Harlan's Creek every 6 weeks, and who was a businesslike man of God who conducted marriages and funerals and Sunday services with equal efficient warmth. It was held at the church on the north end of town, which was a plain white frame building that was also used for town meetings, and on at least one memorable occasion, as a temporary holding cell for 2 cattle rustlers who had been caught before the new jail was finished. The church smelled of pine boards and candle wax, and the particular mustiness of a building that was not heated consistently. Annie wore the blue dress again, pressed carefully, with her hair up in a way she had spent the better part of 2 hours arranging that morning. She carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Pete Garvey had found and brought her, an act of sentiment from the boy that had surprised and touched her considerably. Ralph wore a new shirt that he had bought specifically for the occasion, dark blue cotton that was the nicest piece of clothing he had owned in several years, and he had gotten his hair cut the day before. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come up the aisle and felt something so enormous and so clean in his chest that it was nearly physical, like the first full breath after a long time in a confined space. She took his arm. They faced the preacher. Old Hattie Greer was in the front row and was crying before the first word was said, which she would always maintain was simply the cold air making her eyes water. The farrier was there, sitting with his large blacksmith's hands folded in his lap and looking at the floor in the way of a man who is more moved than he wants anyone to know. Pete Garvey was there, still looking slightly proud of himself about the wildflowers. Walt Harmon was not there, which was consistent with his character, but he had lowered Annie's rent by 15% for the coming year, which was Walt Harmon's equivalent of a wedding gift, and which she appreciated more than any object he might have brought. The ceremony was brief and plain and entirely real. When Abernathy asked Ralph if he took this woman, Ralph said yes with a clarity and quiet certainty that made Hattie Greer's theoretical cold air situation significantly worse. When he slipped the plain gold band onto Annie's finger, his hands were steady. He had bought the ring with the remainder of his savings, and had done it without wavering, which was remarkable for a man who had spent 3 years holding on to money as the only reliable form of security he knew. They walked out of the church and into the March afternoon, and the town of Harlan's Creek gave them a small cheerful send-off of hat waving, and a few cheers, and old Hattie pressing a wrapped piece of cake into Annie's hands, and making remarks about grandchildren that were not particularly veiled. That spring unfolded with the particular richness of things that are new and also already familiar. Ralph moved his few belongings from the stable room into Annie's rooms behind the store, which required some reorganization that they undertook with the same practical efficiency they brought to everything. Her rooms were small, and he was a large man, and they arranged themselves around each other's habits with the occasional bumping of elbows and the necessary negotiations of shared space that are, when they occur between people who genuinely like each other, more pleasant than not. He pursued the blacksmithing with seriousness. The farrier, whose name was Gus Ellard and who had suggested the trade in the first place, agreed to teach him on a formal basis in exchange for 2 mornings of help per week, which was an arrangement that suited them both. Ralph turned out to have a natural aptitude for metalwork, which surprised him, and did not surprise Gus, who said he had known it from the way Ralph used tools, with economy and precision and the right amount of force and no more. Annie's business continued to grow, not dramatically but steadily, in the way of things that are done well and reliably in a community that has learned to trust them. She expanded her stock in the spring to include more hardware items, in recognition of the growing number of homesteaders in the surrounding country who needed tools and fasteners and such things without making the long drive to a larger town. It was Ralph who had suggested this, having noticed the pattern of what people asked for and did not find. They talked every evening. This was something Ralph had not expected to value as much as he did. The simple, reliable presence of a person at the end of the day with whom he could sit and talk about the day and its contents, and who would listen and respond with intelligence and honesty, and occasionally the kind of dry, precise humor that made him laugh out loud, which was not something he had done often enough in his life. She told him once, on a warm spring evening when they were sitting outside the back door watching the sunset over the mesa, that she had been worried before she chose him, that she was choosing too directly, and that it might put him off. He asked what she had decided when she chose him, exactly what it was that she saw. She said she had seen someone who paid attention to the world without demanding anything from it in return, and that she had thought that was either the saddest thing she had ever encountered or the most patient, and she had decided it was the latter, and that patience of that quality deserved to be met with something that matched it. He said, "I think you were overly generous in your reading of me." She said, "I think I was accurate." They sat for a while longer in the evening quiet. He said, "I was afraid, you know, not of you, of the thing itself, of wanting something I might lose." She said, "I know." "I could see it," he said, "and you chose me anyway," she said, "because of it partly. A man who knows what it costs to hope for something is careful with what he's given." He looked at her in the orange evening light and thought that he had somehow, without deserving it, managed to be in a life that had real value in it. Not wealth and not importance and not any of the things that the stories told you mattered, but actual daily meaning, the kind you could put your hands on. In the summer of 1875, the telegraph line reached Harlan's Creek, which connected the town to the wider world in a way that made everyone feel slightly different about living there, some more settled and some less so. The arrival of the telegraph also brought a modest increase in commercial traffic, as word of prices and supply availability could now be communicated faster, and Annie found herself managing a busier set of accounts. She also found herself, by midsummer, managing a particular kind of tiredness and a particular kind of morning sickness that made her stand very still over the kitchen basin for the first several minutes of each day before she could properly function. When she was certain enough about what was happening, she told Ralph on a quiet evening after dinner. He looked at her. He was very still. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than usual, "Are you certain?" She said she was. It was quiet for a long moment. She watched him carefully, as she always watched him, attentively and without judgment. Then he stood up and came to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her chair and took her hands in both of his and looked at her with those gray eyes that were so calm and so deep and said, "I am going to be here for every part of this, every part." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean it in the most complete way I know how." She said, "I know, that is why I am not frightened." He pressed his forehead to her hands for a moment, the large rough hands with the scar on the left one, and she felt the weight of his head bowed over her hands, and thought that this was love in one of its truest forms, not declaration but gravity, the way a thing inclines toward what matters to it. Old Hattie Greer found out within the week, because Hattie had a supernatural capacity for finding out things in Harlan's Creek that Annie had not yet determined the mechanism for. She brought a jar of preserved peaches and a piece of advice about ginger root for the morning sickness that turned out to be entirely effective. Gus Ellard said nothing specific, but appeared the following week at the back door with a small iron hinge he had made that was beautifully crafted and purely decorative, which was not the kind of thing Gus usually made, and which represented, in its own wordless way, a form of congratulation. Pete Garvey said he hoped it was a boy because boys were easier, an opinion that Annie received with a raised eyebrow that made him reconsider the statement immediately and at length. Ralph worked harder in the months that followed, if such a thing was possible. He was by now working 3 mornings a week with Gus, and had acquired skills enough to do basic farrier work and small metalwork commissions for the town, which added to the household income in a way that was meaningful. He was also still doing the hauling and heavy work for the store, which he continued to do without reduction, and he managed the stable and the horse and the small kitchen garden behind the store that Annie had started in spring and that had produced, over the summer, more tomatoes than they knew what to do with. He did not talk much about the coming child to others. He was a private man, and the thing was too important to him to be casual about. But Annie could see it in him everywhere, in the way he moved things out of the path she walked through most often, in the way he watched her when he thought she was not watching him, in the small and continuous adjustments he made to the world around him in order to keep her safe and comfortable. She loved him for it. She loved him for all of it, but for this especially, because she had lived for 26 years being the one who watched out for everything and everyone, and managed the details and anticipated the needs, and having someone do that for her, quietly and without announcement, was something she had not known she needed until it was there. In October of 1875, a few weeks before the birth was expected, they had their first real argument. It was about money, specifically about whether Ralph should accept a full-time commission from a ranching operation south of town that would pay him well but would require him to be away for stretches of 2 to 3 weeks. He thought they needed the money. She thought they did not need it that badly, and that she did not want him gone for weeks at a stretch, particularly now. The argument was not loud, but it was honest, which is to say that it said real things. He said he felt it was his responsibility to provide. She said that she provided too, and that responsibility was not his alone to carry. He said he knew that, but this was a significant amount of money, and he did not want to be the kind of man whose family went without because of his stubbornness. She said she did not want to be the kind of woman whose husband was not present because of his. They sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Is it about the money, really?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Partly, and partly it's the old thing. The not knowing that I'm enough." She said, "Ralph." He said, "I know." She said, "You are more than enough. You have been more than enough since before I knew you well enough to tell you." He said, "I am learning to believe that." She said, "Then learn a little faster," and there was the wry, precise edge in her voice that made him smile despite himself. He turned down the ranching commission. He took instead 2 smaller metalwork commissions closer to town that together paid reasonably well and kept him home every evening. He was home when their son was born on a cold night in November, the 17th, with Hattie Greer and a midwife named Clara Bowen in attendance and Ralph in the front room of the store, which was where Hattie had firmly placed him, listening to the sounds from the back rooms with the concentrated stillness of a man holding himself together by main force. When Clara opened the door and told him he had a son who was healthy and breathing well, and making his opinions known at considerable volume, Ralph stood up and said, "And Annie." Clara said Annie was tired and well and asking for him. He went in. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at her face, which was exhausted and bright at the same time with the particular illumination of someone who has done something enormous, and then he looked at the small wrapped bundle she was holding. His son. The baby had his eyes gray and calm, and Annie's hair color, the reddish dark brown, and the general aspect of a person who had opinions and intended to make them known. His face was red, and his hands were impossibly small, and he was alive and real and present in the world in the specific and irreducible way that new people are. Ralph held him, clumsily at first, with the careful intensity of someone handling the most important thing he has ever held. He sat beside Annie and held his son, and Annie rested her head against his shoulder, and outside the November night was cold and still. He had not been chosen for anything. He had not been given things, or designated, or appointed, or elected. And now he was holding a child, and the woman he loved was leaning against him, and he was in a place that was his, not by inheritance or luck but by the accumulation of ordinary goodness, and a woman who had looked at him on a Wednesday afternoon and decided, in the quiet of the back room with the dust motes and the beans and the smell of coffee, that he was the one. They named the boy Daniel Ford. He was a good baby, which is to say he was demanding and loud and required enormous amounts of attention. And Annie and Ralph navigated the particular exhaustion of early parenthood with the same practical teamwork they brought to everything else, with Ralph taking the earlier morning wake-ups and Annie taking the later ones, and both of them occasionally standing in the small kitchen at 2 in the morning with Daniel on a shoulder, and the fire banked low, exhausted and bewildered and deeply content. The year 1876 unfolded quietly. Harlan's Creek grew by another 50 souls over the spring and summer, bringing 2 new businesses and a second preacher who set up in competition with the Methodist circuit, and the town acquired the slightly more established air of a place that intended to persist. The Main Street got its second saloon, which was a development that divided opinions, and there was talk of a proper schoolhouse, which divided fewer opinions. Ralph had completed his apprenticeship with Gus Ellard by spring, and set up a small smithy of his own in the Lenta stable, which he expanded with lumber he cut, and hauled himself over the course of March and April. He was not yet a farrier of Gus's quality, but he was competent and reliable, and the town had enough horses and hardware needs that he had steady work. He kept his help with Annie's hauling and store management without charge, which she periodically tried to renegotiate into a formal arrangement, and he periodically declined to discuss, because it was something he did as a husband and not as an employee, and he was firm about the distinction. She loved him for that firmness. She loved the way it said something about how he understood the relationship, not as a commercial arrangement but as a shared life, and that he was drawing a line between the two with a clarity that came from having thought about it. Daniel began sitting up in late spring and crawling by summer and making sounds that were not quite words, but that they both interpreted as expressing highly specific opinions on various matters. He was a large baby with a sunny temperament and an absolute iron will about the things he wanted, a combination that they found alternately charming and challenging. Hattie Greer visited every Wednesday, ostensibly to buy cornmeal, but in practice to hold Daniel for 45 minutes while reporting on various neighborhood developments with comprehensive authority. In the summer of 1876, Denton Hale tried one more time. He had not been in Annie's store since the land dispute was resolved, conducting his dry goods business at the establishment across town, but the news of the survey vindication had never quite let go of him, and the success of Annie's store and the evident happiness of her household were, in the particular psychology of a man like Hale, things that felt like a personal critique. He came into the store on a July afternoon when Ralph was at the smithy and Pete was stocking shelves, and Annie was behind the counter, and he made a series of remarks about the quality of her goods and the fairness of her prices that were designed to be both insulting and deniable. Pete went very still and looked at Annie. Annie looked at Hale for a long moment with the direct brown attention that had been making men uncomfortable for years, and said, in her clear carrying voice, that she had been patient with his various attempts to make her feel unwelcome in her own business for going on 2 years, and that she had decided today was the day to stop being patient. She said that if he had a legitimate commercial complaint, he could state it plainly and she would address it, and if he did not, she would ask him to leave and ask him not to come back. She said this without anger, which was the more effective delivery, with the simple flat certainty of someone stating a policy. Hale said something unpleasant about a woman running a business and her husband. Ralph came in from the smithy at that moment because he had heard voices from outside, and something in the quality of the silence between them made him come through the back. He stood in the doorway and looked at the situation, and then looked at Annie. She gave him the briefest shake of her head, meaning that she had this, and he stayed where he was, but he stayed. Annie told Hale that she would like him to leave. She told him this 3 times. The 3rd time, Ralph walked from the doorway to the counter and stood beside Annie, not in front of her, not replacing her, but beside her, and looked at Hale with the gray, calm eyes that conveyed nothing threatening and everything firm. Hale left. Annie said, "I had that." Ralph said, "I know. I came for me." She looked at him. He said, "I wanted to stand next to you." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is an acceptable reason." Hale was not seen in the store again. He sold his cattle operation to a man from Oklahoma the following year and moved on, and Harlan's Creek was not particularly sorry to see him go. The summer was good, and the fall was better. Daniel started pulling himself upright using the legs of tables and chairs, a development that required a comprehensive reconsideration of what was stored at low levels throughout the store and their quarters. Ralph built a small wooden gate for the entrance to the back room to keep Daniel from the stairs, and then built a second one for the kitchen, and then spent an afternoon adding protective rails to the edge of the porch step, because he had calculated every possible trajectory from which a small determined human might achieve harm, and was addressing each of them methodically. Annie watched him do this from the kitchen doorway, and felt something so full and warm in her chest that it was difficult to contain. She had known, when she reached across that hotel table and put her hand over his, that she was choosing well. She had not known quite how completely well. She went out to where he was working on the porch rail and crouched beside him and said, "You know he cannot walk yet." Ralph said, "He will." He kept working. She said, "You are building things for a version of him that is 6 months in the future." He said, "Better early than late." She put her hand on the back of his neck where the hair curled slightly from the heat of the smithy, and he stopped working and looked at her over his shoulder. She said, "I love you." He said it back without hesitation, which was something that had taken him a few months to do without the slight pause that represented the gap between feeling and articulation. He had closed the gap. He said it and meant it, and the meaning was so complete and so settled that it came out plainly every time. She went back inside. He finished the rail and then sat for a moment on the porch in the autumn afternoon, with the smell of smoke from the smithy on his clothes and the sound of Daniel making his opinionated sounds inside and the town going about its business on the street beyond, and he thought that this was his life. This specific collection of things. This woman, this child, this place, this work. His. He had not been elected to anything or appointed to anything. He had not been chosen from a crowd or selected for merit or singled out by anyone in any formal sense. But a woman had looked at him one ordinary afternoon and decided, quietly and without ceremony, that he was the one she wanted, and he had been learning ever since to receive that with the care and the steadiness it deserved. In the spring of 1877, Annie found out she was pregnant again. She told Ralph the same way she had told him the first time, after dinner, on an evening when Daniel was asleep in the small crib that Ralph had built over a whole weekend from pine planks. Ralph's reaction was the same in quality if not in form. He did not crouch in front of her chair this time. He pulled her against him and held her with both arms for a long moment, and she could feel his heartbeat against her temple, steady and strong, the way he was. He said, with his chin resting on the top of her head, "Too." She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." She laughed, and the laugh was warm and real and at home in the air of the room they had made together. The smithy was growing in that year, steadily building a reputation that was beginning to reach beyond Harlan's Creek to the outlying ranch operations and the occasional commission from ranchers and settlers who had heard of a reliable man with fair prices and good work. Ralph took on a helper in the spring, a young man of 19 named Thomas Doyle who had come west from Georgia with more ambition than skill, and who, under Ralph's patient instruction, was turning into a decent metal worker. Ralph was a good teacher. He was clear. He did not become frustrated at a pace that differed from his own, and he had the particular quality of someone who had learned things by being taught without condescension, and who therefore knew how to pass knowledge on the same way. Thomas said to him once, after a long day when something had gone wrong 3 times and been fixed 3 times and finally come right, "You don't get angry," Ralph said. "It wouldn't help the work." Thomas said, "No, but most men get angry anyway." Ralph thought about it and said, "I spent enough years being the person who needed patience from someone else. It leaves a mark." Thomas nodded and didn't pursue it further, but he held on to it. He was at that age when what the older men around you say tends to go in and stay. The second baby came in November, almost exactly a year after Daniel. Annie said she had apparently established a pattern, and she intended to review the relevant calendar in future. Ralph said the joke was better when she told it than when he repeated it back, which was true and which made her laugh. The second baby was also a boy. They named him James, after no one in particular, because they liked the sound of it and the plainness of it. James was a smaller baby than Daniel and a quieter one, with Annie's brown eyes and Ralph's general composure, and he looked at the world from the first weeks with a considered attention that made Ralph suspect he was going to be a thinker. Daniel, who was 1 year and 2 weeks old when James arrived, and who had by this point established firm opinions on almost every aspect of existence, received his brother with a mixture of interest and suspicion that gradually, over the following months, resolved into a territorial affection that was recognizable as love in its toddler form. Ralph watched his 2 sons in the morning light of the store's back room, Daniel attempting with great determination to share a biscuit with James in a way that was not particularly safe, and felt something that he had no adequate word for. Not happiness exactly, though it was that. Something larger and more permanent than happiness, which tends to be situational. Something that was more like certainty. The certainty of being exactly where he was supposed to be. By 1878, Harlan's Creek had a proper schoolhouse, a 2-room affair on the east end of town taught by a young woman from Ohio named Miss Calder who had come west through a teaching placement, and who was, by universal agreement, excellent. The town also had a second doctor, which was more medically useful than the schoolhouse but less symbolically significant in terms of marking the town's increasing permanence. Annie expanded the store twice, first into a storage room she rented from Walt Harmon, and then, when Walt Harmon died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1878 and left his properties to a nephew in Galveston, she bought the building outright from the nephew, who had no interest in frontier property, and sold it at a fair price without making a production of it. This was the largest single financial transaction Annie had ever undertaken, and she made it with the thorough, careful research that characterized everything she did, with ledger projections and supply cost analyses, and a clear view of the monthly revenue that the store generated. Ralph stood in the store the evening after the papers were signed and looked around at the space that was now wholly theirs and said, "You know what you want and you go get it," she said. "Is that a compliment?" he said. "It is the thing I admire most about you, among a long list," she said. "What else is on the list?" he said. "The way you talked to Hattie Greer when she was sick last winter, the way you teach Pete to manage accounts, the way you make decisions and don't second-guess them unnecessarily. The way you looked at me across the table at the hotel that first time and made me feel like I was worth looking at." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Ralph Ford." You were always worth looking at. You just needed someone to look." He said, "You were that person." She said, "I was glad to be." He crossed the store and kissed her in the middle of the afternoon, with the sound of their sons playing in the back room and the street outside going about its ordinary business. And the feeling in the room was the feeling of two people who had found each other in the particular complicated world of the frontier, and had built something out of nothing but steadiness and attention and the courage to choose. Gus Ellard retired in 1879, his joints finally making the decision for him in the way that joint sickness does, slowly and then all at once. He sold his farrier operation to Thomas Doyle, who had become fully capable by this point, and who had also developed a sideline in custom metalwork that owed something to Ralph's influence and Thomas's own considerable natural talent. Gus moved into a room at the boarding house and became a fixture of the town's social landscape, appearing at the saloon for dinner, and at the church for Sunday service, and occasionally at Annie's store to buy tobacco and give unrequested opinions on various commercial matters. Ralph marked Gus's retirement as the end of his formal apprenticeship and the beginning of something he had not expected, which was being thought of as a craftsman. He was making pieces for the new buildings going up in town and for the outlying ranches, and for one commission that had come down through a chain of referrals from a cattle operation in San Antonio, a set of decorative ironwork gates for a wealthy rancher's main house. It had taken Ralph 3 weeks and was the best thing he had made so far. He felt, looking at it before it was shipped, the particular satisfaction of having made something beautiful as well as functional. He was not rich. They were not rich, but they were comfortable in the way that people who work hard and manage well and do not spend beyond their means are comfortable, with enough and a little more, and the little more going into the bank against the future that was no longer an abstract threat, but a specific and manageable thing. Daniel started school in the fall of 1879, at just under 4 years old, which was early but which Miss Calder approved because Daniel's opinions about learning were extremely strong and positive, and it was clear he would benefit more from structured engagement than from waiting another year. He was a child who asked questions constantly, and with the joyful persistence of someone who genuinely expects the answers to be interesting. James was a more contained and observational child, happy to sit with a piece of wood and a stick and arrange things into patterns. Ralph saw himself in James in ways that were both tender and slightly painful, the early signal of a particular kind of temperament, and he made a point of sitting with James regularly and talking to him, and showing him things, and ensuring that his quietness was not misread as absence. He thought often, watching his sons, about his own childhood, and about the father who had been well-meaning but absent in the ways that matter. He thought about how easy it was to be physically present and emotionally elsewhere, and how the distance could accumulate until a child had learned to manage without you and had stopped needing what you could not give. He thought about his father without anger. The man had done what he could, which was less than sufficient, and Ralph had learned a long time ago to let the lack of it lie without letting it define him. Though he also acknowledged, in the honest accounting he did with himself at intervals, that it had defined him in the way that absences always do, shaping the space around them, making him careful about connection, making him value reliability as if it were a moral category rather than a personality trait. Annie had seen this and named it as patience rather than damage, and over the years he had come to believe that she was largely right, that the same quality could be both, and that what you made of it was somewhat in your own hands. He made of it a father who was present, fully, consistently, deliberately present, in all the ways that the word could mean. On a Sunday in the spring of 1880, Annie's 2 brothers came to Harlan's Creek. This was unexpected because they had not, in the 5 years since her marriage, managed to visit, a failing they attributed to the demands of their own lives in San Marcos, and which Annie attributed to a combination of disapproval and indifference that she had made her peace with. The letter announcing their visit arrived 3 days before they did, which was enough time for Annie to decide how she felt about it, and for Ralph to determine, from the set of her expression, that it was a complicated feeling. Her brothers were named Franklin and George Redmond. Franklin was 34 and George was 32, and they were, as Annie had described them, decent enough men in their limited way. They arrived dusty from the road and surprised by the town's solidity and by the store, which was larger and more established than they had apparently expected. Ralph met them with the same calm attention he brought to everything. He shook their hands and looked at them directly and said very little, which some men find reassuring and others find unnerving. Franklin, who was the more expansive of the two, seemed to find it unnerving. George, who was quieter and more observational, seemed to find it reassuring. The visit lasted 3 days. Over the course of those 3 days, several things happened. Franklin made remarks about the wisdom of the commercial decisions Annie had made over the years that were phrased as questions but were in fact opinions, and Annie addressed each of them with the patient, factual accuracy of someone who has made peace with the source of the skepticism. George watched Ralph with Daniel and James in the yard behind the store on the afternoon of the second day, and said nothing at the time but came to Ralph afterward and said, without preamble, that he could see Annie had done well in her choice and that he was glad for it. Ralph said thank you. He meant it. On the morning of the third day, as the brothers were preparing to leave, Franklin said to Annie, with a gruffness that was his version of sincerity, that the place looked well and that she had managed the thing better than he had expected, and that she had their father's instincts. Annie looked at him for a moment and said that she was glad he could see that, and the conversation had the quality of something being put to rest without quite being named. They rode out on the third morning, and Ralph stood with Annie and watched the dust of their horses fade down the road and said, "How do you feel?" she said. "Settled, confirmed, a little sad for old reasons." He said, "That is about right." She said, "You were patient with Franklin." He said, "He loves you. He does not know how to show it without making it look like criticism. I know that kind of love." She looked at him. She said, "You are a good man, Ralph Ford." He said, "You are the reason I know how to be one." She said that was not true, and he said it was more true than she knew, and they did not resolve the disagreement but stood in the spring morning with the road empty and their sons playing behind them and the store waiting at their backs. That afternoon Ralph went back to the smithy and made something that he had been turning over in his mind for a few weeks. It was a small iron decorative piece, not functional exactly but not purely ornamental either. It was a pair of hands, roughly made but clearly recognizable, clasped together. He made them carefully and set them on the small shelf in the back room of the store, on the wall above the table where they ate their noon meals. Annie noticed it the next morning. She stood in front of it for a moment and then turned and looked at him. He was stacking crates and he looked back. She did not say anything elaborate. She said, "Thank you." He nodded and went on with the stacking. She looked at the iron hands for a long moment before she went about her mourning. The years after 1880 were good years. Not without difficulty, because life in a frontier town was not without difficulty, but the foundation was solid and the direction was forward. Daniel grew into a quick-minded, enthusiastic boy who wanted to know how everything worked and who had no patience for not understanding something, which made him both Miss Calder's favorite student and her most exhausting one. James grew into the contemplative child everyone expected him to be, with a particular gift for drawing that Ralph encouraged by making him a small set of iron drawing tools when he was 5. Simple straight edges, and curves that the boy used with a concentration that was remarkable for his age. The town continued to grow and Annie's store continued to grow with it, and Ralph's smithy continued to build its reputation through the quality of its work. Thomas Doyle ran his farrier shop next door, and they had a comfortable professional relationship that had evolved from student and teacher into something more like colleagues, two craftsmen who respected each other's work and occasionally collaborated. Harlan's Creek got its railroad spur in 1882, a branch line off the main cattle route that made the town significantly more connected to the commercial world and brought new people and new money and new problems in about equal measure. Annie's wholesale arrangements became considerably easier and cheaper overnight, which improved her margins and let her extend the hardware inventory that had become a reliable source of revenue. Ralph got his first large-scale commissioned work through the railroad connection, a contract to supply ironwork hardware for a new livestock facility south of town, which required 2 months of intensive work with Thomas's help and was the largest commercial project he had ever managed. When it was done and paid, he sat at the table in the back room with the payment envelope and thought about his father's farm in Tennessee and the $37 he had arrived in Harlan's Creek with and the distance between then and now. He was 40 years old. He had a wife and 2 sons. He had a trade and a reputation and a building that was his and a horse that was still named Colt and who was, for a horse his age, in remarkably good shape and still adequately fast. He had 11 years of waking up in the same place and going to sleep in the same place and knowing the name of his neighbor and having the farrier's schedule memorized and knowing that when Wednesday came around, old Hattie Greer would be in for her cornmeal, reliable as the sun. He had a life that was utterly, completely, entirely his. Daniel was 9 years old and James was 8, and they were different from each other in ways that were beautiful and occasionally challenging and always interesting. Ralph spent his Sunday mornings taking them out to the edge of the creek on the east side of town, which still ran clear and good in those years, and teaching them things that he knew. How to find a sound piece of wood, how to tell which direction the weather was coming from by the smell and the color of the sky, how to hold something heavy without hurting your back, how to be still and wait for the thing to come to you rather than chasing it. Annie would sometimes come with them, on the mornings when the store was closed, and the week had been long enough that a Sunday at the creek felt restorative. She would sit on the bank with her boots off and watch Ralph with the boys and feel the particular fullness that she had learned was the texture of a good life, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something worth coming home to. She had chosen him on a Wednesday. She had been choosing him every day since. In the fall of 1883, when Daniel was 10 and James was 9, they sat at the Sunday dinner table and Annie said she had something to tell them. Ralph looked at her. Daniel looked at her. James looked at her with his particular considering attention. She said that there was going to be a new person in the family sometime next spring. Daniel said immediately and with great confidence, "A brother." James said, "Maybe not." Daniel said, "I am right about things." Ralph said, "You are right about some things." Daniel considered this and decided it was close enough to agreement. The new person arrived in April of 1884, and Daniel was wrong for the first time in recent memory. The new person was a girl. She had Annie's hair and Ralph's eyes, and a set of opinions that she expressed at high volume from the first minutes of existence. They named her Eleanor after no one in particular, because it was a name that sounded like the sound of something good. Daniel, who had been so confident about a brother, looked at his new sister for about 30 seconds and then became so completely devoted to her that his previous prediction was forgotten entirely by everyone, including Daniel himself. James looked at Eleanor with his habitual careful assessment and decided within a week that she was worthy of his attention, which was not something he extended casually. Ralph held Eleanor the same way he had held Daniel and James on their first nights, with the same careful reverence, but with the additional ease of someone who had done it before and knew what he was holding. She was small and red and emphatic and entirely herself, and he sat with her in the chair by the window of their rooms and talked to her quietly while Annie slept the necessary sleep of someone who had done something enormous. He said to Eleanor, in a voice that was no louder than necessary, that she had come into a good place, and that she was wanted, and that she would be given everything that could be given. He said it plainly and with no fanfare because he was not a fanfare kind of man, and Alina seemed to find this agreeable because she went quiet while he spoke and looked at him with the unfocused newborn gaze that was nevertheless somehow attentive. He had not been chosen for anything. He had been chosen for this. The spring of 1884 was warm and good. The creek was high with snowmelt from the hills, and the air had the green smell of things growing. The store was busy, and the smithy was busy, and the house behind the store was full of noise and argument and laughter, and the ordinary extraordinary texture of a family that was genuinely glad of itself. On a warm May evening, Annie and Ralph sat on the back step after the children were asleep, in the quiet that comes at the end of full days. The stars were extraordinary over the Texas plain, as they always were, thick and clear and ancient. The smell of the smithy's banked forge drifted from the lean-to, and somewhere out on the edge of town, a single coyote called and was answered by another. She said, "Do you remember Miller's Pass?" He said, "Every detail." She said, "I was so angry at that wheel." He said, "You did not look angry, you looked competent." She said, "I was both." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I did not know what was starting." She said, "Neither did I. I knew something was starting. I just did not know how large it was going to be." He looked at the stars. He said, "I was going to walk away." She said, "I know. You were already walking." He said, "Why did you call after me?" She thought about it. She said, "Because you fixed the wheel without looking to see if anyone was watching. You just saw that it needed doing and you did it. That told me something." He said, "It told you to hire me." She said, "It told me you were the kind of person I wanted to know." The night was warm and still. Inside, Daniel and James and Alina were sleeping in their respective ways. Daniel sprawled wide and taking up the full width of his cot, James neat and contained, Alina in the cradle that Ralph had built in the weeks before she arrived, curved and smoothed and sanded to a softness that had no rough edges anywhere. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The coyotes called once more and went quiet, and the stars burned on in their enormous, unchanging way. He thought about the Wednesday afternoon and her hand on his across the table, and the word she had used, steadiness, and the long years before Harlan's Creek, when steadiness had been the only thing he had, and he had not known it was enough. He thought about the iron hands on the shelf in the back room. He thought about Daniel's questions and James's drawings and Alina's emphatic opinions and Annie's voice through the wall of the stable. He thought about how a life is built. Not from grand moments, but from daily accumulated choosing, from the hand put over the hand, and the coffee made for two and the shelf bracket fixed without being asked, from the patient's repetition of ordinary care until care becomes the structure itself, the thing that holds everything else up. Ralph Ford had not been chosen for anything in his whole life. And then a woman had looked at him on a Wednesday afternoon in the back room of a dry goods store in Harlan's Creek, Texas, and decided, quietly and without ceremony, in the middle of the most ordinary kind of day, that he was the one she wanted. He had not known what to do with it. He had learned. He had learned that being chosen is not something you receive and set aside. It is something you answer, every day, in the small continuous ways that make a life real. He answered it by being there, by being steady, by learning to say what he felt before the feeling outgrew his ability to say it, by building things with his hands that were meant to last, gates and rails and shelves and a cradle, and a small pair of clasped iron hands on a shelf in the back room where they ate their noon meals together. By sitting on the back step on a warm May night in 1884 with his wife's head on his shoulder, and the sound of his sleeping children inside, and the stars above the Texas plain and the coyotes answering each other across the dark, and knowing, without question, without reservation, without any of the old fear that things would be taken away, that this was his life, fully and completely his, and that it was good. "Ralph," she said. "Yes," he said. She said, "I would choose you again, every Wednesday." He held her a little closer. He said, "Then I am the luckiest man in Caro County," she said, "in Texas." He said, "I will not argue." She laughed, soft and warm and entirely at home in the air around them, and the stars went on burning and the town went on settling into its own good night. And everything in Harlan's Creek was as it should be, solid and real and tenderly, permanently chosen.